La da da, la da da.
Where's your guitar?
Oh yes, I better grab my guitar, huh? Summertime.
Ah.
Summertime. When the living is easy.
Wow. Yeah, that's great for the beginning. Thank you. Thank you so much for the serenade.
It's an honor and pleasure to be part of your podcasts.
Oh, thank you so
Thank
much.
you so much. It's a special honor also to have met you. Yeah, because the last 10, 14 years we were practicing. We practiced in the Kamakatri school, and we mainly did ngondro, meaning thousands of prostrations, time and mind, and so on. And we were always fascinated by the 6 yogas. And yeah, we didn't get an access to that before we met you, actually. Yeah, and
you should have, studied a little bit more mathematics before doing your ngondro, because in Sagadawa, anything you do one time, it's Sagadawa, this Vesak month, known in Tibetan as Bumgyur, becomes 100,000 times the merit. So when you do your prostrations, you can do 100,000 for the other 11 months, or you can wait the Sagadawa and do one, and you get 100,000.
Good deal.
Yeah, sounds good.
There we are, I think the 6th or 7th day into Sagadawa. So if you've been doing one a day, prostrations, that just gives you 600,000 or 700,000.
Yeah, that makes it easier.
Yeah, for that reason, a lot of Tibetans in Sagadawa, they do their ngondro for the first 2 weeks of Sagadawa. And just so long as they remember to do one of each, they complete all 100,000. So then you don't even have to bother counting, because anyone can remember. Yeah, I did one. At least one.
but do they really count it like that? No, yeah?
Well, otherwise, why would they call it? I count it like that. You see, I went to engineering school. And so for us, mathematics has meaning. So if you're going to say something is Bumgyur, in Tibetan Bumgyur, 100,000 multiplied, I sit down with a piece of paper and I go, 1 multiplied by 100,000.
I want to have it on paper.
Okay, sounds fair.
Yeah. Yeah, I was lucky with Tummo introduction in that living in Dharamsala with many great lamas in the area, and many peoples in retreat on the mountain above, where people would do. It wasn't unusual for people to do 5-year, 10-year retreats. One guy had been in retreat for 40 years. I mean, he finished the first, 25 years in Tibet, and then China invaded. So he carefully sneaked out over the mountains without, what would you call socializing? Because it was a solitary retreat. He came and just set up. He was a disciple of Kyabji Ling Doshi Chung, the Dalai Lama's great tutor, Yungsen Chumbo, as they called him in Tibetan. And so that was his main retreat master. So he just sort of found a little cave 5 miles up the mountain behind where Ling Rinpoche moved as a refugee in India, and just kept going. And so in that tradition, there's not much of an emphasis on ngondro in general, you could say. It's more your personal relationship with your own teachers that dictates the pace of your what you do, what practices you're introduced to, and how you do them. And so I was lucky. I got a bad stomach after about 6 months in India. And so one of my main teachers, the one appointed by Dalai Lama to be our, what they call in Tibetan, Peti Gegen, leading finger point by finger point, said, oh, you have to start doing Tummo if you're going to spend time in India, because it gives you it'll give you perfect digestion, and your stomach will become like a cast iron pot, indestructible. And so after a few months in India like that, I was introduced to Tummo, not as so much as the inner fire of the 6 yogas tradition, but rather as the foundation of all highest yoga tantra healing practices. So it doesn't matter, every highest yoga tantra, Yamataka, Guhya, Samaja, Chakra Samvara, so on, they all have Tummo practices in them, and they can be used in many ways. But all of those highest yoga tantras have a specifically healing application of them. And so for that reason, I was introduced to them quite early in my enlightenment career. I once said that to a French guy. Career, you cannot say. No, I think I used the word bodhisattva career. I said early in my bodhisattva career. I was kind of playing with different words and how they sound and work for these kind of spiritual ideas, right? Like, you cannot say bodhisattva career. It's not a career. A career is a job. So I said, enlightenment career? It's a little bit like a job. Takes some effort, some dedication, time, application, all the things a job normally requires. And then maybe a few months later, Gyabje Trijang Dorje Chang, sort of the greatest Dalai Lama school holder of the 6 yogas, announced that he was going to give his last transmission. He was becoming very old, and big public teachings were difficult. I mean, as refugees in India, everyone was scared that lineages would get lost. And many of these lineages had 1 or 2 living holders of the specific lineage. You take in Kargyupa, you've got 12 schools of Kargyu. And in Kargyu, over the years, each of those schools developed completely independently of one another for 800 or 900 years, right? And so each of them had holders, and maybe 1 holder, 2 holders left in each of those schools for many of their lineages, right? So when Gyabje Trijang Rinpoche announced that this would probably be his last transmission of 6 yogas of Naropa, 6 yogas of Niguma, that meant all the young tulkus and all the young lamas in training from all over the world immediately wanted to attend, because to get it from him, the greatest living master in Dalai Lama school, was like a big deal. And I was a fly on the wall.
Wow, good karma to be such a fly.
And so on account of that, I was introduced to it quite early. And I think the specific Lama instructor the Dalai Lama had assigned to train us Western people, he was a Tummo enthusiast. So he had all of his students doing Tummo quite early. And he wasn't a ngondro enthusiast. For us, he said, like, look at Milarepa. Milarepa never did any of the ordinary ngondros. Marpa just made him build a house 7 times and take it down and move the rocks and put it up. So he said, I don't want to give any of you any specific formal ngondro. And with each of you, I'll decide, we'll think about what would be most appropriate in your specific cases. So rather than, anyway, I wanted to do the 100,000, so I'd sneak up to the temple and do my 100,000 prostrations. And I like the Vajrasattva, so I, in my spare time, did 100,000 Vajrasattvas, and I like the mandala offerings. Mostly, I think I like the music about them. Yeah, and Guru Yoga, I built myself a little hut and did the Guru Yoga practice 100,000 times. Usually in the evening between about 11 o'clock and 2 o'clock, I'd go out and do them because the rest of my time was sort of busy with other trainings. But our teacher wasn't big on formal ngondro. Rather, he wanted each one to kind of do what would be useful. So with the mothers, for instance, anyone who had a baby, it was like spending an extra like 2 hours a day with your kid. They said, look upon your child, your little kid as your guru.
Oh, that's a tough one.
And he says, that's sufficient for your Guru Yoga practice. Often we think, you know, we as the adults are the teachers of the kids, but when you look at the wheel of life from the Socratic or Plato point of view of reincarnation or Buddhist point of reincarnation, we don't choose our kids, they choose us. And I think very often they don't choose us because of our great qualities. They choose us because of lessons we still have to learn, and they've got the muscle to do it.
And we become each other's platonic caves.
Something like that. Yeah, it's like, you know, in Buddhist Abhidharma, someone looking for reincarnation, a person basically is floating around in the bardo, looking for the reincarnation, and sees the parents and feels the karmic, sees prospective parents making love, and develops strong affinity or sense of karmic link with one of those. And therefore they comes into their life. I would say it's really supposed to be a win-win situation. The parents should be able to learn from it, and also the kids should be able to learn from it. But anyway, so our guru said, our Lama said, with the moms, if you have kids, just for a couple of hours a day, spend time with them and think of them as your guru, as your Lama. Because in fact, young people with kids, in a way, they are on a high learning curve, aren't they? And learning to communicate with a very young child is in a way almost like communicating with Buddha mind. I mean, for a child less than 3 years old, the conceptual mind is still quite unformed. The brain power is limited, so they're working on a much subtler dimension. EQ, emotional consciousness, higher than IQ, processing consciousness. Yeah. Anyway, I didn't go in for that. I went in for the Tummo. Because I had a bad stomach and it was referred to, and then I thought, well, this is nice. And then I noticed it benefited all of my other practices as well, and so pursued it.
But you were very lucky to have received that. But nowadays we can see that there's distinction between the secret methods and those that are widely available. And also even back in Tibet in the Middle Ages, it was this distinction between the monastic Buddhism and yogic Buddhism, and some of the methods were not available to even Buddhist practitioners, but only for those who are going on retreats alone. And one of
I don't know how much that is true, really.
Yeah.
You know, if we read the biographies of lamas from past centuries, we see many different models. Okay. Tibetans have a saying, Lama rere chulugurere. Every lama is his own sect. Oh, yeah. Yeah, so there's often more difference between two lamas of the same school, students of the same master in that school, than there is between two lamas of different schools. Mm-hmm. Who happen to have very similar ideas or approaches to training their students. I think, you know, because the big monasteries were also educational and babysitting institutions. I mean, you would be put in them often as early as age 5 or 6, and then age 9 or 10 or 11. So you would learn to read and to write and to memorize, and you get your whole education from them. So naturally, you know, when you're that young, 5, 6, 7, 8, they don't really want to give you the most sort of secret kind of, or you know, Sangha, they're secret too. Doesn't mean it's secret from anyone, but often just means wrong song, incomprehensible, self-secret. Like, for instance, my books on the 6 yogas are out there in half a dozen languages. So including Chinese and, you know, Russian and so on. They could be read by a couple of billion people, but the number of people with a karmic connection with them is another issue. And people who pick them up and read them and think of them as meaningful or can find the meaning in them. There's kind of a self-secret quality, you could say, to Tantra. Therefore, you know, a lot of the Tummo comes from the Tantras like Chakrasamvara and Guhya Samaja, which are known in Tibetan as Begyu, hidden Tantras. And it's not that the Tantras are hidden, but the meaning is hidden in a kind of a code language. And so in Tibet, you could walk into any publishing house and buy the most secret manual on the most secret practice, but you wouldn't be able to understand it, basically.
Exactly.
Unless you had the initiation and the transmission, Wang Lung Ti, initiation, transmission, and explanation.
But even to those who want to discover it, it's not available in every lineage to have access to Tummo. It's being said you need to go for a retreat, you have to complete certain steps. And we were trying to look for the way of learning it, because there is this need from within. That's why.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
We were wondering what's the purpose of that secrecy, what it really protects people from, and why what type of benefit it brings when you have access to it.
I think different people have different ideas on this and will speak about it differently. And the way I would speak about it as a white guy is very different. A white Irish Canadian, you could say, will be very different than the way a Tibetan will speak about it. I think in the Tibetan world, when you became a monk or a nun or whatever, it was almost like being adopted into a clan or a family. And therefore, those family secrets, those family lineages were sort of carefully guarded and entrusted, you could say. And the access to them, if you held that lineage and were a teacher of those lineages, there was a kind of a thought that whoever joins this stream or this river, plunges into this river, it's a little bit like becoming adopted as the son of a king or something like that. You know, we see the problem right now with this idiot Prince Harry, right, when he marries a bride from outside, and how the inability for her to carry the dignity and the responsibility of the lineage, right? And so then she's there and it's like, oh, all this standing up and waving to crowds and traveling and speaking. I want to be a reality TV star. You know, so she's happy to become the princess, but she's not happy to behave like a princess. She wants to be a reality star where, you know, all your private stuff becomes totally public, and American TV standard reality stuff, right? So I think the same is there with the lineage, in that once you're adopted into it, you sort of become a holder of that lineage and an ambassador of that lineage. And so there's a kind of a protective side there. So you won't threaten the dignity, you could say, or endanger the dignity of the lineage. But then there's also the strength of the school. So I am a little bit of a mind that Tibetans in exile are different than Tibetans in Tibet in the old days. As Tibetans in exile basically have a kind of a refugee syndrome, you could say. And so lamas are very concerned with preservation. So in Tibet, the emphasis was enlightenment. In exile, there's a bigger emphasis upon preservation of lineage and particular preservation of sect. You know, so if you go, for instance, as I was saying, 12 Khargya schools, some of them are kind of small. And how to keep that lineage alive and well and going becomes a concern. So I think one of the issues with only if you commit fully to the school and commit fully to, you know, doing the 3-4 year retreat, something like that, then will you be given access to kind of the deeper teachings? And I think it's a little bit to do with refugee syndrome, because we see it wasn't like that in olden days in Tibet. Travelers who went through Tibet interested in studying Buddhism were pretty well given access to whatever they had showed an interest for, and if they could meet a Lama who is willing to teach them for whatever reason. So I think that's part of it, is a kind of a preservation of specific sect lineages.
Great.
And so, for instance, whenever I'm with a Tibetan, meet Tibetans for the first time, if they're monks or lamas, the first question is, what's your Dharma lineage? And I'll often reply, I don't have any particular lineage. But then they won't be happy with that. They'll fish around and say, Yinyang Sawi Lama Rusure, who's your root guru? That's sort of a hint, right? And I often say, whatever initiation I've received, in that specific practice, that is my root guru for that specific practice.
Oh, very good.
And still they will say, but, Mikse Suyare, one special one? No. Or they'll say, Ying Tukla, one who really touched your heart. They'll sort of really fish around to sort of get that sort of grip on things. And I don't think that was the situation in old Tibet. They would, in pre-invasion Tibet, pre-refugee situation, I think is part of the refugee syndrome. And it's come into the teaching status and, you know, all of those kind of teaching regulations or modes of teaching and transmission and all of that. And it will probably continue for another 25 or 50 years. Because, you know, right now with Tibetans, right, you've got many of these sects or lineages or whatever you want to call them. They have one or two lamas responsible for feeding some thousands of kids, often the new generation of people in training, right? I mean, Painter Rinpoche in South India, for instance, who died, I don't know, roughly a decade ago. I mean, he was kind of the main fundraiser for 6,000 monks in that. And, you know, monks from all over the Himalayan regions wanting to study in Nyingma would go to his monastery, all over Bhutan, come out of Tibet and so on. It was like the main training monastery for Nyingma. And, you know, Dilgo Khyentse's monastery in Nepal, which is kind of a small monastery, they would do their basic studies there, but then go to the one in South India. And so it's like that with all of the high lamas in all the schools. So there's this sort of emphasis on You know, how do we preserve our lineage, continue our lineage under these very, very endangered times? And often when we as foreigners, we look at Tibetan Buddhism, we think, well, it's pretty stable. They got the Dalai Lama, these great lamas and monasteries with 5,000 to 6,000 monks and nuns and so on. And, you know, plenty of retras and kshetras, but it's really very, very fragile compared to what it was prior to the Chinese destruction of Tibet. And in Tibet, every time it seems like things are going better, suddenly the Beijing government will make things go worse, give them a downturn. And, you know, for instance, in Tibet on the East Coast over in Kham, they had that Tergar monastery with Khenpo Chime Punzok. Was it Tergar? And I don't remember the name exactly, but anyway, with, you know, it had like 40 or 50,000 people coming and doing 3 months retreat, 3 months study, 3 months retreat, 3 months study for like, you know, 7, 8 years, and then going and doing longer retreats in remote places. Naturally, the Chinese government panicked and went in and just bulldozed the whole thing and closed it down, and took Khenpo Chime Punzok and put him in a hospital for medical evaluation, where he died, you know, a few months later. Then later, some of the students from that rebuilt sort of a monastery again in a different place and went up again to about 40,000 people, and mostly Chinese practicing Tibetan Buddhism, or many, many of them Chinese. And then the government comes in and says, well, most of these buildings are unsanitary and not up to standard, and so you're only allowed to have 5,000 maximum. So they come in with bulldozers and knock down. And so every time things seem to be going back to a natural way in China, inside Chinese occupied Tibet, things go downhill because of a government policy of some despot or other, some, you know, little local warlord or administrator, or sometimes there's a direction from either the central government in Beijing or from the military or from the secret police, the so-called, what do they call them in there, the Public Security Bureau. In other words, secret police, not so secret police. And secret there doesn't mean self-secret.
True.
Yeah, so myself, when I travel and teach, I mean, I teach Lojong and I teach Lamrim, these sort of standard kind of practices from the sutra side, or common, what they call in Tibetan Tumongi Lam, the shared path, which is the foundation of Tantra. And within Tantra, you know, I also teach Tara practices and Shenrazis and Hamitayas and Manjusris and so forth, for whatever are the specific needs of specific students. But I do like to try to get all of my students to do at least 20 minutes of Tummo every day. Like it or not. And the nice thing about Tummo, if you don't like doing it by yourself, you can always practice it with a consort. So for young couples, they think, well, that's kind of nice, you know, isn't that much, but if my lady love and I can do it at the same time, or the lady, if my fella and I can like meditate together, that's a nice idea. Of course, monks don't like to recommend that sort of thing or discuss it.
Sounds very good.
And the reason they don't like to is just simply not that it's not commonly known, because all Tummo texts in Tibetan state clearly there's 2 ways to practice. Rang lula tamba, shen lula tamba, in reliance upon one's own body and in reliance upon a body of another. In other words, a consort. And that often it's said after that you shouldn't rely on a consort unless you have arrived at the qualified stage. Of course, that's often said in Tibetan texts, because a lot of these practices are taught from monks. So if a monk practices with a consort, if he's not qualified and he allows liquid to leave, or the female loses power, then they lose their ordination, and it's a pepam, a great downfall. But for your average non-monastic, non-celibate, it's no big deal. You know, for that reason, we see some discussions in early Tibetan texts of Tummo and the consort practices associated with Tummo being taught in India, largely because aristocratic Indians like to fight a lot. You know, they're always at little petty wars with one another. We often say Buddha was a prince. Really, he was a son of a barbarian warlord. You know, the fourth caste often they'll say princely caste. It's actually the warrior class. Those guys had to train in the martial arts, warfare, and all of that sort of stuff. They also had to train in others, but when it came to war, they were the ones who went out and fought it, not the farmers, not the businessmen, not the tailors. It wasn't like in Europe where, you know, you put a bunch of farmers with pitchforks out in the front as cannon fodder to slow down the cavalry attack. It was like the warrior class went out there and clashed. Yeah. And so you see some references to how in early India, Buddha put the emphasis upon Shenlula Tamba, reliance upon the body of another, because so often in India, because of the constant fighting and whatnot, the young aristocrat men, the warrior class men, would often have multiple wives, and so therefore they weren't really interested in just sitting down by themselves and, you know, watching their navel. In other words, doing Tummo by themselves. If they practiced, they wanted to practice with their wives. And of course, their wives too. As most men know, ladies, if a man ignores her at all, usually becomes discontent, malcontent, and is not shy about expressing that malcontentedness. In other words, she grumbles. Some might even say nags. And so, you know, according to the legend, when King Indrabhuti went to the Buddha and requested Guhya Samaja Tantra, he said to the Buddha, now I need a practice that I can do while making love, because I have 500 wives and I'm running a kingdom and I'm running an army and I'm responsible for everyone going to bed at night happy in my whole kingdom, you know, full belly and at peace and without brigands on the streets, you know, breaking into their houses and robbing them. I've got a lot of work to do. I don't have any time for sitting under a tree watching my belly button. And so you have to, the only time I have, I should be spending with my wives. So you must teach me a meditation I can perform or practice with my wives. Otherwise, it'll be grumble, 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 nag, nag, nag. I'm not sure how you say grumble, 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 nag, nag, nag in Sanskrit.
I think he also mentioned that he wouldn't like to forsake his bodily pleasures and like the samsaric pleasures, and to seek for the methods that fit their enjoyment of the relative.
Well, yeah, that was another issue, that some of the mandalas out there around, outside of the Chakrasamvara, inside of the mandala are the 8 charnel grounds with dead bodies and the vultures eating the dead bodies. And so in old days in India, when people died outside of villages, they'd sort of have a sacred place at the edge of a forest where you'd lay out the body as an offering to the wild animals. And that was considered better than burial or cremation. Burial, of course, takes up land, and then your body's eaten by bugs, which is kind of, you know, not as meritorious as offering to birds and tigers. I mean, if I were to say, who should my body go to? A tiger after I'm dead? Not alive, please.
That's important detail.
A tiger or a bunch of bugs? Well, I kind of like those tigers, and, you know, bugs can eat lots of things. They don't have to eat me.
But there is much more of them, so you can get more merit because more beings will be fed of your body.
Yeah, but then there's
The calculation part.
then there's the merit of the object, you see, because also if you offer something to a saint or you offer it to just an ordinary being, the merit, there is that, you see.
Multiply 100,000.
Now we have to have these sort of what is it, a slide rule when you do merit calculations mathematically. It's not a one-on-one.
You need to write another book about that, Lama Glenn.
Yeah, so anyway, King Indrabhuti said, in my mandala, no charnel grounds, all that death stuff and all that. I don't want that. I want a celebration of the senses. And of the celebration of the senses, having 500 wives, give or take a few, then that's an important side to things. And that same story is told for how the request made by King Suchandra for the Kalachakra Tantra. So actually, the Buddha taught the Kalachakra Tantra before teaching the Kuya Samaja Tantra. So probably Indrabhuti had heard that Suchandra made such a, what would you call it, brazen request, an unshy.
Yeah.
When you say
shameless, unshamed request, he thought, oh, if he'll do it, why not me?
And when you say the Buddha, like Indrabhuti asked the Buddha, like it was Indrabhuti, I think there were different ones, but it was already like medieval India, like after the time of the historical Buddha Shakyamuni, like.
Yeah, you know, so Indrabhuti is a name like Jonas. You may wish that you were the only one in history, but too late. There was already a American rock and roll band called the Jonas Brothers. And then there's Jonas and the Whale. And if you go back over history, you'll find probably tens of thousands of Jonases. So Indrabhuti, Indra just is the name of the god Indra, right? Bhuti, I think, means son. I could be wrong. Putra means son. Anyway, it means something about some relationship, something to do with Indra. I'm not sure how Tibetans translated his name, and that would tell me what Bhuti referred to. But anyway, maybe something like glory or something like that, Indra's glory, something along those lines, or Indra's light or something. I'll look it up later. But yeah, so there are many, many of them throughout history, but three very important ones from Buddhist Tantric side. And one is the one who requested Buddha for that Tantra. And so we like him for that, because otherwise, who else would say such a thing to a Buddha? It's like, would you go to, I don't know, what school of Kargyu you are, but would you go to the head Lama and say, excuse me, all this refuge stuff and prostrations and Tara mantras, just give me the sexual yogas, please.
Take a lot of guts.
It takes you have to be a little bit, have a couple of shots of whiskey before you walk in. So we like him, that Indrabhuti, for having that kind of chutzpah, as the Jewish people like to say. That was kind of chutzpah. And then there's a later Indrabhuti who is one of the earlier lineage masters, probably 4th or 5th century, something like that. And a later Indrabhuti who is a well-known commentator or wrote big commentaries to the practice. But we see that throughout history in every tradition, not just in Buddhism, where having the names of great masters from the past is a popular thing. So for instance, in the West, we got a lot of Peters. I don't know why. Peter was just a fisherman who was crucified upside down. But anyway, there's still a lot of Peters out there. And a lot of Johns, which becomes Jonas somehow, right? Isn't that the same root? John and John. I think so. I think it's the same root.
Yeah, there was one Jonas in Bible, the one that spent 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the big fish. It's the same story also in Buddhism, right?
Yeah, in Buddhism, I think it's Minapa, yeah.
Minarpa, yeah.
Or Matsyendra, the...
I mean, so if we go through a history of European names, we see a lot of them being repeated. And with kings, I mean, in England, you've got Henry I, Henry II, Henry III, Henry IV, Henry, and my favorite, Henry VIII.
Oh, right.
I'm Henry VIII, I am Henry VIII, I am. I got married to the widow next door. She'd been married 7 times before, and everyone was an Henry. She wouldn't have a Willie or a Sam. I'm a wraith old man called Henry VIII, I am. Yeah, so anyway, we see names repeated and used. And so I think with, a problem we have, and you mentioned in your email, you'd like to talk a little bit about Buddhist history and Tantric history. A problem we have with Buddhist history is that in the Western tradition is they don't rely upon lineage. They rely upon Oxford and Cambridge, 2 of the most inbred and insular institutes on the planet. And these guys had their basic introduction to Buddhism when they arrived in Sri Lanka. And so then, according to them, whatever is in Sri Lanka is original Buddhism, and everything else is a corruption from Hinduism. And so we see that written everywhere from, say, 1800 to almost 1920 or 1930, something like that. And, it continues well over 100 years. And of course, students of professors talking like that tend to pick up those same silly ideas. And if you don't, you do your thesis and you don't write the same thing they were saying, you're challenging them. So then it becomes a big political issue. So there's a lot of repetition of errors.
Okay.
And I noticed this in my own work, just say, for instance, with Dalai Lamas. An early British scholar had written that the first Dalai Lama was a nephew of Tsongkhapa, the founder of Gelugpa. He doesn't say why he thought that or how he thought that. And from that time on, until my book on Dalai Lamas came out in the late 1980s or mid 1980s, every reference to the first Dalai Lama always said nephew of Tsongkhapa. They never checked up. And in fact, they were born between 1,000 and 2,000 miles apart. And one Tsongkhapa was of a, nomad. Father was Mongolian, his mom Tibetan on the border of Mongolia and Tibet. And the first Dalai Lama was born in southwest Tibet in a very poor, herding family with no connection with that part of the world whatsoever. Then when he was a young kid, he was put in Nartong. His father died when he was 7 years old. And so the mom figured she couldn't feed all 4 of her sons. So she had divinations done on them, what to do. And they said, well, that I think he was a third-born or second-born son, a third-born, I think. And his name in Tibetan was Shawakir, a running deer. Running deer would make a good monk, and why don't you put him in Nartong Monastery under his dad's brother? And so he entered Tashi Lumbo under his uncle's guidance. Geshe Chushe was the guy's name. And somehow this fact that he went into Nartong under his uncle got to, he was a nephew of Tsongkhapa in some early writing of some Oxford or Cambridge guy, and then their students repeated, and then it was in all kind of little learned papers here and there around the world, and then it found its way into constant repetition and travel books and all the rest of it. So a little bit the same with Tantric Buddhist history, and even Mahayana history becomes totally perverted in that way. seen through that kind of lens. Whatever the Buddha taught should be in Sri Lanka, and if it's not in Sri Lanka, it should came from somewhere else, and is a later development or a later in creation, you could say. And yeah, so I don't go along with it. I'm a lineage guy. I've never heard a Tibetan Lama say anything like that, although some of them are starting to graduate from Western universities, so they may start picking up these silly ideas. It's a little bit like and start repeating them as though somehow they were fact, even though this totally silly way of looking at things. Silly, I say, silly.
And once you mentioned that Buddha himself collected 4 different enlightenment streams.
Well, this is we sometimes see it said that, Buddha didn't invent enlightenment. He gathered the lineages from, they're called Sangye Rabdun, from the previous enlightened beings. And so Buddha himself is often said to be the 4th of the Buddhas of this auspicious eon. And the traces of their enlightenment teachings were still floating around everywhere. And so there's various ways to talk about his teaching and what he taught and how he taught. But one of the ways is to look at what was in that part of the world, Buddhist part of the world at that time. And so if we look at what Buddha was in Buddha's part of the world at that time, we see 4 major trends, you could say. And so often Tibetans link these to the 4 sacred places, right? And these 5 sacred places, with Bodh Gaya being the center, and these have changed over the centuries. But so, in the center is Bodh Gaya, to the north is Shambhala, is the modern reading. The north to the west is Udayana, to the east is Riwat Singha, the 5-peaked sacred mountain, and to the south is Potala, which in Chinese became Putashen. And so these are the 4 sort of sacred grounds, you could say, that all come together at the center of this mandala. And what are those 4? What if we look at those 4? Now, not in the way they're looked at by Tibetans later, because Tibetans, of course, aren't very good at history. They didn't have the slide rule equation. But if we look at it earlier from various evidences of what was there. And so, yeah, when we look at it those ways, so we have, of course, from the south of India, the kind of celebration, you could say, of sensuality. And from the center and from the east, Orissa, we have kind of the aesthetic approach, sort of the dropout aesthetics. And the west, the doctrine of light. And the north, the shamanistic tradition. So I think these find their ways really well, perfectly expressed in, say, Guhya Samaja Mandala, or Chakra Samvara Mandala, the so-called Baigyu, hidden Tantra mandalas, where we look at each of these. The West is Amitabha in infinite light. And if we look at Bun, for instance, Bun in Tibet claims that that Bun is older than Buddhism. Tumpa Shenrab was a reincarnation. The Buddha was his reincarnation.
Wow.
And so Tumpa Shenrab comes long before the founder of Bun, who traveled from Persia and came to Tibet, according to their wonderful system of mathematics 60 million years ago or something. Anyway, when they use those kind of numbers, it's just to say, so long ago, we're not exactly sure when, but long ago.
That's more like it.
Yeah, and so, you know, Namkha Norbu does his books like that, you know, the crystal and the light and so on, because coming from this sort of western side of India, you could say, when, like, for instance, why do we call India Hindus? Because they arrive, you know, what's his name? Alexander the Great arrives at the Indus River, and he notices they're very different than the Persians. So he calls them the Indus guys, the Indus folks. So they become the Hindus, you know, meaning the Indus-rooted culture.
Mm-hmm.
So that, we could say, really the doctrine of the light, and that becomes symbolized in later Buddhism as Udayana, Padmasambhava's birthplace. You know, so that's very much with the so-called Dzogchen teaching, or, you know, doctrine of the crystal and the light teaching, and so on. And then we go to the south and sensuality and so on. In the mandala, the south is Ratnasambhava, isn't it? And Ratnasambhava represents, when we look at something, any object of the senses, we get, I like, I don't like, I don't care. I like it, I don't like it, I don't care. And this is useful, you know, little kids, if they see a spider, may have an instinct, don't pull off one of its legs, it'll bite you and it might be poisonous. It might be an instinct, right? But a lot of it's cultural. And so Ratnasambhava's source of all prosperity is noticing how everything is equally good. Nyamnyo Yeshe transforms into the wisdom of the equal goodness of all things. Shit is just another way for manure, and manure is just another way of word for food for vegetables and flowers. It's a good thing. Whenever I'm traveling in the States, if someone says, man, that's bullshit, I always go, very useful substance, bullshit. In India, Tibet, they use it for their fires, they use it for fertilizer, they even use it as cement on their houses. So this teaching from the south that all the objects of the senses might have a good, a bad, and indifferent immediate reaction based on our kind of instinct, you could say, genetic instinct, and also based on a cultural acquisition. For us to be truly rich, we must be able to see the goodness in all things, and therefore wherever we are, we're rich. We've got all good things wherever we are. And so it's called
that's the one taste philosophy, isn't it?
I don't know about one taste, that's a little different. I don't think you can say, you know, everything is one taste in that sense, but we can say everything is good in one way or another.
Okay.
And we can go through anything in history and see something good. You know, it's in our Irish wisdom where we say, every cloud has a silver lining.
You still got the accent.
You know, so like that. So bringing in those teachings. And then from the east, from Orissa. And, you know, Orissa was and Bengal were very famous as sort of the love capitals. You know, like if you go through, until you've got like the Bengal bowels, as they're called, these sort of wild musical groups, jungle groups who go back thousands of years. And they just, you know, you have like an 80-year-old grandfather playing his little 4-stringed or 2-stringed or 3-string guitar, and the grandson singing and dancing these amazingly sexy songs. And you know, in Bengal, or you go through Orissa with the Sun Temple, where on the outside is people making love in every kind of position, and you go inside and things are much more stark. So we could say, bringing that together, and many people think that the essence of the Tummo teaching, and particularly the Karma Mudra teaching, are very strongly linked to that lineage, that ancient lineage. Now, if you look at it from to the point of well, what you have as formal Buddhism in Sri Lanka. Monastic Buddhism represents a totality of Buddhism, and that's the way Buddha taught it, and so on. So when people say that, we Irish, especially if you're Irish Canadian, you grew up playing hockey, there's the expression, the best defense is a strong offense. And where does Sri Lankan Buddhism come from? I would say, well, King Ashoka sent his idiot son down to Sri Lanka, carrying King Ashoka's brand of officially endorsed Buddhism, the blueprint of it that he wanted to use throughout his kingdom for social stability and easy integrity of the masses, 3 higher trainings, Noble Eightfold Path, and so on, 12 links of dependent origination. And although Tantra did come and go from Sri Lanka, the kings always resisted it, and it basically got kicked out. For instance, Nagarjuna's own son, Nagarjuna's main disciple at 150 AD, Aryadeva, was from Sri Lanka. And he became one of the greatest Madhyamaka writers, and also his Charya Samuchya is perhaps the greatest early treatise on Tantric Buddhism. So if we look at it from lineage point, there's no question that every lineage of Buddhism thinks that of practicing Buddhism is of the opinion that historically the Buddha taught these various lineages to students. Mm-hmm. Some say that it goes according to a prophecy. So Buddha says, my Dharma will last 5,000 years, and for that reason, it will go in 500-year increments. And the first 500 years will be dominated by one style, the next 500 by another style, the next 500 by another style. It's a little bit like, say, with Padmasambhava, when he gives his teaching and the Dharma, the treasured traditions. He doesn't just teach everything. He says, now this one is kind of useless for the next 1,000 years, but 1,000 years from now, it'll be quite useful. And this one is like another 1,800 years will be quite useful. So don't bother with it until then. It's kind of just leave it on the shelf. A little bit like when Milarepa left Marpa to go practicing. Marpa said, well, at some point, you're going to have a real difficulty in your practice and a lot of pain, and you'll hit a stone wall and you won't be able to go past there. So take this little text and don't read it until then. He goes around with it for 15 years before he figures, oh, I guess this is it. I'm like really in a befuddled situation and I have to unbefuddle myself. So if you unbefuddle, is that like you just fuddle? So he opens it and does the practice and everything straightens out and he achieves enlightenment. The sort of story goes like that. So Buddha, and if we look at Buddhist prophecies from various sources like Lankavatara Sutra, Kala Chakra and so on, we see a similar kind of idea. So then Buddha says, well, during my first 500, the outer teachings will be most pervasively strong. And of course, that's what King Ashoka endorsed. The Noble Eightfold Path is the be-all and end-all of what people should do. And, you know, if you really want to go beyond that, sit under a tree and watch your breath. Mm-hmm. And I don't say that in a sarcastic way. Or do I? Sometimes sarcasm is hard to know. It's like jokes. They don't always translate well to a foreign language.
Or even foreign heads sometimes.
Yeah, sure. So then Buddha says, 450 years after my passing, a great master will come from the south in the land where the kusha grass grows, that is blessed by the Nagas, and will achieve great accomplishment.
Mm-hmm.
And so then along comes Nagarjuna. Naga means blessed by Nagas, and Juna, great accomplishment. And he says, okay, all of this blueprint of what's supposed to be and how things are supposed to be, that King Ashoka sponsored, and being a, tin pot dictator, he didn't allow anything else to go anywhere. I mean, the only people allowed at King Ashoka's conference were those he invited, right? Mm-hmm. And he was sat as judge and jury over whatever was included. Mm-hmm. And so he said, so Nagarjuna sort of thinks to himself, and I'm channeling Nagarjuna, because, that's the only way you can know what Nagarjuna was thinking. Why are we following the dictates of that tin pot dictator Ashoka? We should be the ones deciding what is and what isn't. So, then he started bringing out the other sutras and publishing them widely against, dictates, against monastic dictate. Mm-hmm. And those monastic dictates having been the condition and the ruling situation from the time of Ashoka, because King Ashoka, it was hard to resist him. He made like Genghis Khan seem like a softie.
Oh.
He was a tough guy. You either went along with what he said or you were in trouble. But he wasn't exclusively a stick kind of guy. He was also a carrot. If you went along with what he said, you got lots of government sponsorships. Mm. And so carrot and stick. So Nagarjuna said, well, I don't think we have to review all of that. And so then he started rooting around what was not there during who wasn't invited and what lineages did they hold. Mm-hmm. Then, of course, he brings out the Avatamsaka Sutra and the Prajna Paramitras and publishes them and teaches them publicly, sort of. So this is Buddha's. And so then when he does that, he's like 50 years old, right? So Buddha says 450 years out after my passing will come this guy, blessed by the Nagas with great accomplishment. And he will bring out my inner teaching. And so that's when the inner teaching gets brought out very publicly. And so then he starts teaching when he's 50, so that ushers in the second 500-year cycle of Buddha's teaching, you could say, or wave of the 5,000 years of the enlightenment tradition. And that goes for another 400 or 500 years, and then King Indrabhuti, I think the third comes out and publicly teaches Tantra, much to everyone's chagrin. Because, Buddha himself, when he taught these things, they were taught to cloisters of 3. And each one was only allowed to teach to 3. And so they were kept very underground. I think in the early days because of King Ashoka, perhaps, but also in the spirit of Padmasambhava, that and his Dharma tradition, and emulating that same spirit, I should say, that different teachings become very relevant at different times and can be widely propagated at different times, widely taught at different times. And so that third 500 cycle is when we see everything going from small lineage, we could say coven, we use that word sometimes for small groups of mystical practitioners who are basically preserving lineages and passing them for future generations. And we have no idea, of course, how many more of those are out there, right? We just know which ones were brought out. And so we can say that first 500 years the people who get all of the newspaper print are the so-called Sravakas, the listeners, and their direct descendants from Ananda. And the ones who get all the print from Nagarjuna's time are the Bodhisattva heroes, you could say. And from the third phase, or the third unfoldment of that lotus flower, we could say it's the Tantric Mahasiddhas are the ones catching all the scandal and attention, making all the noise. And then at the end of that third period, then Buddhism, the Muslims have invasions of India are weakening India stronger and stronger, and at the end of that third period, we can say Buddhism disappears into India and goes to foreign lands, and therefore thereafter is largely preserved in, you know, Tibet, China, Japan, Vietnam, Sri Lanka, other Mongolia, other countries such as like that. So that becomes the fourth 500-year period. And at that time, I think it still held quite a strong connection with its Indian root, even though it was largely destroyed in India. You know, sort of Sanskrit studies were still there, and with a lot of those people, and a direct sense of the link to India and the Indian root. And then the next 500 years, the fifth 500-year period, is when Buddhism becomes universally provincial. Tibetan Buddhists are Tibetan Buddhists, Chinese Buddhists are Chinese Buddhists, Japanese Buddhists are Japanese Buddhists, Sri Lankan Buddhists are Sri Lankan Buddhists, Thai Buddhists are Thai Buddhists. They don't have any form of communicating with another, separated by distance, by language, and by, you could say, cultural acquisition or cultural transformation, transforming Dharma. As Dharma gets assimilated anywhere it goes, naturally it takes something of the clothing of that. Late great Sharmapa Rinpoche once put it that way. We could say Dharma is like a naked man traveling through foreign lands, putting on clothes wherever he goes to match that. He didn't say man in Tibetan, they just say person. So it could be a lady, and I like the idea of a naked lady traveling through those foreign lands. And I think that's kind of true, and that eventually people identify more with the clothing than with the naked person inside the clothing. So, you know, Zen Buddhists would look at Tibetans and say, what a bunch of weirdos. So that's not Buddhism. And the Sri Lankans would look at the Zen people and say, what a bunch of weirdos. That's not Buddhism. And Tibetans would look at the Chinese and Sri Lankans and say, oh my God, those guys really don't get it, do they? Yeah, so it just sort of developed into that kind of provincial nature, you could say, with each of the countries becoming its own form of Buddhism and having a sense of, you know, those being strong enough, and not to say that's a corrupt form, it's just a geographical, historical and cultural kind of unfoldment, right? And then when do we empty, when do we, you know, so that's the fifth, and then when do we come into our present one? 1956, 7 years before my birth.
Came into the new age.
Well, no, I'm 72 years old, so I don't know how new age that is. But anyway, it's
next 500.
It's the next 500. It began in 1956, and it was ushered in by Prime Minister Nehru in India, who was a closet Buddhist, and I don't know what else he was a closet of, but at least a closet Buddhist. And he wanted world Buddhism to throw money into India to rebuilding Buddhism in India. So he called a conference of leading Buddhist masters from all the countries around the world, Buddhist countries. And not everyone could come because communism had taken over some parts of China. So some could come, but you know, the main participants being Tibetans, Sri Lankans, Thailand, and I think Vietnam and Japan. China sent some, you know, Chinese Chairman Mao sent some delegates and so forth. Mongols sent some delegates. And that became sort of the birth of the new 500-year period. And of course, what was the common language? English. So that's officially, that's when the Dalai Lama first came, you know, to, you'd say the West, because India is really the West. You know, English is said to be an Indo-Germanic language group. You know, we go 1, 2, 3. The Germans go un, zwei, fire. Is that right?
Zwei, drei.
And the Indians go ik, do, tin. 4 is char, like that. So the first 10 letters of all 3, English, German, and you see very closely. And we see many other, of course, English since then became corrupted by Latin and by Greek and by French, and those Vikings swooping down and raping our women, and some of them even staying and introducing Viking words. But yeah, so that began the 500th time. And our age is, I think, a very exciting phase, because those of us born at this time, we get to play a part in the face the Enlightenment tradition will take for the next 500 years. We could say 1956, all of the Buddhists of the world had to take off their clothes and stand naked and become modern. So at that time, for instance, in China, Maoism had swept China, and the Cultural Revolution hadn't yet started. I think that started in 64, but already, you know, the Enlightenment tradition was under threat, and soon was to become everything. All the 4 olds were to be destroyed, and only you should study Mao's silly little red book. And Tibet was already taken over by China, and its destruction was basically looming on the horizon.
What is our role for this 500 years?
Well, now Buddha said 500 years after my passing, my Dharma will go to the land of the red man. Of course, that means Irish. Because when Irish get angry, their face turns red.
And after they leave the pub. Oh my God. Yeah, it's working.
Yeah, so I think, you know, as naked Buddhism comes from Sri Lanka, naked Buddhism comes from China, from Japan, from Korea, from Mongolia, from Tibet. You know, it's our job will be to see what is the nakedness and what is the cultural clothing that it was worn in.
Makes sense.
As Samdang Rinpoche, one of the great lamas in the Tibetan world, great academics at least, and maybe a great lama, I don't know. But anyway, as he once put it, the essence is there. We have to look what is the essence as opposed to what is cultural acquisition. And he said this at a conference in the West, when he said, for instance, in Tibetan tradition, the emphasis is on bodhicitta, emptiness, and tantra in terms of essence. He says, now when it comes to cultural acquisition, he said, many Tibetans only took 1 bath a year. We had a national bath day to remind people that if you already didn't, now is your time. Later, this was changed. They changed the name in the West. The translation, the Tibetan name remains the same, but they changed the translation from National Bath Day to World Purification Day.
Wow.
Anyway, Rinpoche's statement, we have to look at what is essence and what is cultural acquisition, and keep and use and preserve the essence. And with cultural acquisition, whatever seems useful, keep it, and whatever doesn't, then don't worry about it. And I think, you know, all Asian teachers are really struggling with that, especially Tibetans who grew up in the monasteries, and, you know, they're 4 or 5 years old when they're put in a monastery, and they grow up completely in a secular monastic setting. I mean, of course, there's spiritual activities there, but their culture, their monastic life, we can call secular. You know, being in a monastery, what are the habits of monks in monasteries day to day and things like that? We can call that a kind of cultural acquisition. And so I always tell people, I never ask any Tibetan Lama anything about romance, sex, or money, or politics. They do not have a cultural background giving them a sensible opinion on such matters. And even if they're no longer monks, you know, but they were monks for 25 years, you can take a monk out of the monastery and out of his robes and give him 100 girlfriends, but you can never take the monk out of that person. They will always continue to teach with something of a monastic bent on things, even if they themselves have not been a monk. You know, they've lived in monasteries most of their lives, and most of their teachers or students are monks, and so on. So I think for us, our big job, well, first is to achieve enlightenment as individuals. I mean, every you know, red man. First job is achieve enlightenment and accomplish Lungden Tokpe Chu, the Dharma, which is realization, and Dharma, which is transmission, to gather both the living lineages and the practice, gain the realization. But the second of those, beyond that, it's how to drop so much of the cultural baggage that comes with things that in that society was very important. Now, we can see problems that come up in the West with people who do drop some of that cultural baggage, and problems with other cultural baggage that comes that isn't dropped. Yeah. You know, so we can see it going both ways. For instance, if we see with Sogyal Toku and sort of all the sex scandals that sort of damaged their Dharma centers, and he was doing such a wonderful job. Now, in the Tibetan world, sexuality was a very frivolous thing. It was a very casual thing. They didn't have like Western morality about sex. It was very common if you slept in someone's home that, you know, they would say, oh, if one of the ladies is interested in spending the night with you, would you like to have her come to your tent tonight? I was just communicating with a gay friend of mine in south of France just this morning, actually, and he bicycled through Tibet, and he said he tented in like remote areas, and he said it was a little bit difficult being gay because, you know, in the evening, like there'd be these little scratch sounds, and outside would be some beautiful young lady who wanted to come in and spend the night with them, and it's, you know, it's like a grass to a tiger. I don't eat grass. Send me your brother. But of course, he couldn't say that because he didn't know Tibet. Lucky he didn't, or they may have beaten him up. Who knows? Yeah, exactly. But you know, it's very common. For instance, when a Tibetan girl married someone, that she could make love to any of the brothers or cousins up to like 32nd cousin. It was not at all considered a negative thing, because if she had a child, it was nice. It's the same.
It stays in the family.
So it's the same bone lineage, they call, because father's lineage is called bone lineage, mother's lineage is called blood lineage. So from the point of view of usually in Tibet, men went to war, not the women. So if you got into a fight, you wouldn't be killing your own brother somewhere, right? Or your own cousin. You would all be on the same side. I think it was a little bit like that. And also it was just considered, you know, nice for the ladies to have diversity of sexual activity, and quite nice for the guys if some of the unmarried and some of the other married cousins had wives who took an interest in them. It's kind of nice. When the fellow was out for 3 days watching the yaks up on the top of Drikung, that they could spend a few evenings with her.
And
and so, you know, so then, and then young traveling lamas, it was very similar, you know, like someone like a Sogyal who's, when he was young and good looking, you know, it's very common if they're traveling for, you know, young ladies to say, oh, I'd like to spend the evening with you, and are you up to it, so to speak?
It has, I think, something to do with the division of the land as well. If there's
no, I think well, that's different issue. That's different issue. Sometimes one man would marry many. If you were wealthy, one man would marry many girls, and if you were land family with many men, many brothers would marry one girl.
Yes.
So that's a different issue. We're just here talking about, you know, peoples like Sogyal bringing cultural baggage to the West, like Tibet's kind of openness towards sexuality and sort of casualness of it. And then coming to the West, where to us, I mean, you know, the reason we're not in Garden of Eden is something to do with a snake and an apple and a fig leaf and sex. And, you know, then 2,000 years of Catholicism telling us, you know, women are the root of all evil and so on and so forth. So it's kind of, you know, a cultural clash, you could say.
Yeah.
And so in Tibet, what Sogyal, his lifestyle was perfectly acceptable. Nobody would have thought anything about it. You know, it just would have, of course, rumors would spread and they'd all be known and all that sort of thing, but it wouldn't be like a big deal. It's like, if it's interesting to you, okay. If it's not, then don't open that book, so to speak. Change the TV channel. But in the West, it, you know, becomes a different thing culturally. And of course, culture is also attached to legal. So then there's some legal differences. So on the one hand, you can have that problem. And then on the other hand, you have, say, China, which is traditionally a very racist country. The word for foreigner is generally barbarian, and they've got a few different barbarians who come by sea, and barbarians who come by horse, and barbarians who come by camel. But if you come to China, you're a barbarian. And so then they get in the West, and, you know, teaching to a barbarian is like a no-no. This is, you know, Dharma is Chinese knowledge in their mind, and so sharing it is like a cultural no-no. So that can be a problem. And then you get other kind of cultural things, like people who've been monks all their life and try to make their students become like little monks and nuns as much as it's possible, while still being not necessarily a full monk or nun, but at least sort of be a little bit more like a monk or nun. So how to get rid of all of those kind of cultural baggages, exactly, and at the same time bring out the essence. Mm. And certainly in America, you know, I think the Jewish psychologist crew has been big on that, has made a great contribution. People like Jack Kornfield and, you know, Larry Rosenthal and Joseph Goldstein, Daniel Goldman, is that his name? Dan Goldman. I mean, there's sort of these Jewish shrinks, if you will, who studied a lot with Buddha Das. Many of them studied with Buddha Das in Sri Lanka, one of the great, very open-minded Thai forest meditators, and taught in a very open way. And when they came back, they sort of brought back his teachings with kind of a pop psychology jargon, you could say, and put them in that framework. So I think that's been a very wonderful contribution, and that's thanks to the blessings of Buddha Das from Thailand, or the great contribution. Tibetan word is kat in kindness, but it means beneficial activity of great Buddha Das. and those early students. And then, of course, when Trungpa and Sogyal both studied in Oxford and picked up sort of psychology jargon, and so they both taught in quite a psychology jargonese, if we can make that as a language group. Psycho-jargonese. And I think Trungpa liked a little bit the color chakra and the militant side of things, and Sogyal, I think, seemed to sort of go more a little bit towards the shock therapy, sort of like, what is it? Gestalt. Something like that. And then you have others who are more like, a little bit more like Roman Catholic, kind of outer look, and inner a little bit more calm and sedate, and using a kind of a more conventional kind of less, you could say less hybrid kind of language in their communication. Mm-hmm. But it's still all a kind of a work in progress. I was at a translation conference in New York some years ago, and one of the lamas suggested that what we need in the West is a dictionary for translation, so everyone uses a common kind of language. And I was invited to sort of say something about those kind of ideas as a translator and writer of many books. And I said, the problem with that is we don't have any words in English with work well with Buddhism universally. And English is also a very emotional word. So we can say
abstract.
Not many words mean what they say. You know, if we say bullshit, we don't actually mean bullshit. We mean something we think is useless or worthless or throwaway. That doesn't refer to that building substance which keeps half of India's houses standing upright. Many words are like that. Not just use slang, but we can say something, just simple words, like if we say the word cunt. People don't like that because it sounds like old German, and it reminds us that we're old Germans, you know, and as a culture, right? And so we far prefer the more dainty vagina, which is Latin and obviously more Catholic. Both are referring to exactly the same article, if you will. Sunja in Tibetan, the same phenomena. But the fact that they don't have anything of the same kind of emotional resonance. So I said, so it's coming up with a dictionary. You know, we get people like the German-Canadian translator Herbert Gunther translates the word Bodhi or Jangchob, enlightenment, as limpid awareness and consummate perspicacity. So I said, if everyone here will sign off on using limpid awareness and consummate perspicacity every time they encounter the word Bodhi in Sanskrit or Jangchob in Tibetan, I'll sign off on a dictionary.
Yeah, me too.
I will sign off on that. We're going to have a problem. And right, you can see that in translation, can't we? The way Alex Berzin, for instance, who lives in Berlin, translates, he uses his own approach to language, and the way Bob Thurman in New York does, uses his own choice of language. And then we have I can't remember the name of the group that writes a lot and translates a lot for Shambhala books. But anyway, they have their own use of language, and it's kind of in a state of transition at the moment, isn't it? Mm-hmm. A problem is because language is very easy when you're talking about tables and chairs. But when you go beyond it to more abstract phenomena, we can do it now. You know, the Lama who suggested this, of course, because in Tibet, when Buddhism came to Tibet, and Sangtsen Gompo in about 630 had a group of 25 scholars make a dictionary. And then if you wanted to go on the government stipend for translating, you use that dictionary. And so another option is, of course, anyone holds up a dictionary and say, these are our words, and we're willing to give anyone who wants to sign off as a translator $100,000 a year for the rest of your life to translate using this dictionary. You'd have quite a few volunteers. What if they just hold it up and say, we think this is a good dictionary, please use it. You know, I'm going to think to myself, limpid awareness and consummate perspicacity. Right. Give me $100,000 and I'll say that, but no thanks. And for many other words. I mean, the Lama who studied that, who made that suggestion, for instance, in one of his translations for the Tibetan bird Digpa, he uses sin. Yeah. So as an Anglican Christian in my youth, I don't like that word sin because it's a Christian term largely defined by the Christian sense of original sin. And so therefore, the Buddhist meaning of Digpa is quite different. And just things like lust or duchak. Lust in English is quite different than duchak in Tibetan. You know, someone pay me $100,000 and I don't have to worry about getting the book published or sold. And it becomes like in Tibet, where it just gets printed and put in a monastery, and once a year you take it out and villagers touch it to their head for the blessing, then okay, it'll work. But if you're trying to communicate meaningfully to a reading audience, the challenge is much, much bigger. So yeah, for us red-faced people, our first thing is Lungten Tokpe Chö, gather the lineages and transmissions and accomplish the realization. And then to figure out a meaningful way to embody those linguistically, culturally, socially, romantically, musically, in every facet of our own life. And not that everyone, you know, doesn't mean everyone becomes a teacher or something like that, but as a Buddhist, the way we use language should incorporate some sort of enlightenment flair, if you will. Sort of like if you're going to do jazz, you know, you kind of should wear sunglasses and go like that. When I put hip hop on, do hip hop, you should put your hat on backwards and throw away your belt and remember to keep pulling your pants up. A little bit the same for Dharma in the West. We really have to learn to bring the enlightenment knowledge and the enlightenment experience into our own life, and then to embody that culturally, socially, artistically, as we ourselves see fit. And I think as I said at that time, we won't see any uniformity coming in the near future, because right now, we're still working on finding a common language for the enlightenment experience and Dharma transmission, if you will, and how to embody that in our ordinary life in the West with a different legal system than Tibet, a different moral code than Tibet, and a whole kind of, well, Me Too-ness of America, if you will, everyone looking for someone to grumble about. It makes a whole different cultural situation. In Tibet, if anyone was going to grumble about you, it'd be like, you know, the brother or the father coming over with a big stick and hitting you on the head. That would be the grumble, right? Whereas in the West, America in particular has sort of gotten into a mass hysteria, mob violence frame of mind. Yeah. Everything is that kind of a mob violence, and whip up hysteria and crucify who you can kind of thing, and everyone hopping on board to do that, regardless of the consequences, long or short term, to the lives of those peoples involved. And it's sort of it's being done with something of a religious fervor, much like communism.
Yeah.
Mao ran out and had any old musical instruments burned and destroyed, any old books burned and destroyed, any old buildings burned and destroyed. It's done with that same kind of communist fervor, which is a kind of a religious fervor, you could say, kind of a mob hysteria. And so how Buddhism can exist in the West in that kind of a chaotic, unenlightened, you could just say ignorant cultural space is kind of another issue. You know, the West, we always hear people say, oh yeah, we live in the highest culture, you know, we're so progressed, blah, blah, rely on science. Meanwhile, science is filling our rivers with killer chemicals and plastic bags, our air with all kind of pollutants. And of course, COVID was a scientific development by the Wuhan Virology Institute, creating how to take animal viruses, transform them so that they could attack human, on the basis that if you don't do that, they eventually will probably transform in that way. And when it does, they'll come as a surprise. So if you transform them first and then work on how to cure them. But it's like saying, let me shoot myself in my head as an experiment for how neurosurgery could cure me.
Yeah.
So, you know, if things are in this kind of environment, sort of things are sort of developing nicely in some ways. Another conference I was at, it was pointed out, the Dalai Lama was sort of the keynote speaker, guest at it, guest of honor, you could say. And at it, they had a American professor sort of mention a little bit the progress of Tibetan Buddhism in the West. And she went through a long list, but in brief, she said, well, when you guys came into exile in 1959, there were no Buddhist and Tibetan Buddhist centers in the West. Now there's over 1,000 in North America and roughly the same in Europe. And some of these are quite big. And at that time, there were no Tibetan studies departments in any universities in America. And it was always studied as a kind of a 6-year Sanskrit or something in European universities. And now we see Tibetan academic studies in many universities. So as she was pointing out that in the 60 years, or that time it was maybe 55 years that Tibetans have been in exile, Dharma has gone from a very small world, Tibetan Dharma has gone from a very small phenomena in the world, limited really to Central Asia and a few academics, to almost every city in America now having half a dozen Dharma centers of various sizes, and the same in Europe, and retreat centers, and 3-year retreat centers in south of France, and 2 or 3 of them in North America and all that. So we can see that this 500-year prophecy is unfolding to some extent. And I think the big challenge for a lot of the Asians is that we in the West aren't really interested in sect or are interested in enlightenment. And just like when Buddhism went from India to Tibet, it didn't stay Vaibhashika or Sautantika or Chittamatra or Madhyamaka. It became Kagyu or Ralu or Shiche, or it became based on whatever that person brought to Tibet, and created an effective study training program. And it sort of took on that rather than be this Indian school or that Indian school. And if you go to China, there's no such thing in China as this school is this sect or that sect from India. It's rather Chan or Tendai or one of the many schools developing in China in the various regions and areas based on what sutras and tantras and so forth they like. And again,
I also have noticed even in the Western Buddhist this type of attitude to preserve the sect that they got introduced into. I see it as either novice syndrome or the zealot type of syndrome. Just, you know, if you got already introduced, you have to preserve it as such. And they are actually, being Western Europeans, they also fighting others that want to see just as an essence. By saying that it needs to be preserved to the letter in the form it was introduced to.
Yeah, I mean, that's why I say in some degree, I think the first job of Westerners is to get transmission, and also secondly, to achieve some kind of realization rather than just words or form. Because lung literally means energy, meaning form. When we achieve enlightenment, lung becomes rupakaya, mind becomes dharmakaya. So people who get attached to the forms, and that's fine if they do, but we could say it's a phase that Western Buddhism will go through. And sure, some schools will develop in the same way that you have, you know, Harvard and Yale and Oxford or Cambridge in the West or whatever. You will have schools that will develop, but they will become less Asianized and more internationalized, I think. Of course, practitioners in particular schools, coming from top down from the Asian teachers, there will be an emphasis that, remember, you're this school or that school. You know, and we see that even with really great lamas. I won't mention the lama in particular, but for instance, some friends of mine in Hawaii brought over a lama maybe 30 years ago or 40 years ago. Yeah, over 40 years ago now. And when they told that this lama, who was their kind of one of their main root gurus, they brought him. He goes, nor champore, not so mare. Oh, that's a great mistake. He's not one of us.
Wow.
You know, even though the guy was a Rinpoche and a qualified Rinpoche and well-seasoned Lama, well-practiced, mature, and like that. But from that Lama's side, even though, you know, he was the head of one of the, you know, 30 Tibetan schools, for him it was disappointment because it wasn't someone from his particular school. And in that, his job is to preserve his school. I can see that. And I can sympathize with that because he's also raising money to rebuild the schools in India and support those schools as refugees. And in Tibet, everything was destroyed. And so if they're to be rebuilt, someone has to find the funding to rebuild them and so on. And I've seen that in, I would say, many cases, 20 or 30 cases with very high lamas where there is a stronger enthusiasm, a strong enthusiasm for any student to be exclusively dedicated to their school. And that's fine, that's fine. And in Buddhism, we often say, the teacher attracts students of the according Leitung Wangpo, karmic connection and mental predisposition, mental power. But here, not really meaning how intelligent they are or something like that, but more what suits their kind of mentality. Like, for instance, when I was based in Upper Side, New York City on the Upper West Side, when I'd go out, I used to like to go to the poetry clubs down in the East Village. And so for that, I'd go down Riverside Drive all the way down to maybe 14th Street or a little lower, and then cut across and pull a right and get to the poetry club that I used to go to. And going past that, I would pass what was known as the Leather District, where all the sadomasochistic clubs and the guys walk around dressed in leather and carrying whips, and, you know, ladies wearing like leather tops with very short leather skirts and, you know, legs with kind of see-through kind of black thread nylons kind of stuff and high heels. And lots of people dressed like policemen and sailors and stuff, like firemen and stuff like that. And, you know, those clubs attract those kind of people.
Mm.
And from my side, you know, I wanted to go to the poetry club. To me, people, you know, people in odd outfits weren't that interesting for me, but to them they were. And so I shouldn't begrudge them that in any way, so long as it's legal. And if it's illegal, sometimes things that are good become illegal. So even if it's illegal, it very possibly is quite okay. Who knows? You know, it's not my job to make such a decision. But from my side, I like to go to the poetry clubs, and they have in America, they used to have these things, they still do, called slams, where once a week anyone can come in the early evening, and they start with, say, 30 poets, and everyone reads one quickly, and then half of them are eliminated. And the next round, those 10 read, and half them are eliminated.
Really?
And then the next round, everyone gets to do one more, until you get down to just 2 finalists.
Oh.
And, you know, you usually, sometimes you have judges, but sometimes you'll have like open voting. You can say which was your favorite, but usually the ones I like to go to would have judges, you know, published poets who would decide what they liked. There's too much. Having everyone in the crowd say, I like this or I like that, wasn't that interesting to me. So I prefer to go on the nights if I knew some of the judges who were going to be judging. That way it's just very quick, right? Otherwise, gather all those votes. And, yeah, and then at the end of the slam, end of the month, they have a grand slam for all the winners for the months too. And those poetry clubs across the country, then if you're a slam winner, you can enter the grand slam, which is a national. And that's held in a different city every year. And then the international slam is held for all the national winners. And I think last year it was held in Paris, which is cheating because the French don't know anything about poetry. And they always, because they don't know anything about poetry, they think French poetry is good, so they give it to French people. Different strokes for different folks. Yeah, so anyway, Dharma is in a little bit of that kind of a situation where, you know, where there's, you know, people get attracted to different traditions and different lineages. And I certainly don't object to anyone doing anything, provided it's legal and nobody gets hurt as much as possible. But, you know, anyone does anything, some people, I suppose, are bound to get hurt simply because if you put a swimming pool in your backyard, there's a bigger chance that someone's going to fall in and swallow chlorinated water. But I think in general, yeah, Dharma is growing very wonderfully in the West. We see, I mean, probably 100 Goenka Vipassana, Burmese Vipassana centers, and a few hundred Satipatthana from Buddha Das, and all the different schools probably have 100 or so each of the main Tibetan schools, so big and small across the country. And yeah, and we're only, you know, what is it, about 70, 1956, 60, 70, 80, and we're only like 60 some years into it, so 65 years into it, so not bad, huh?
And any last advice for those who are coming into that age with you?
Well, I think it is important that people, if they want to be part of the 500-year blossoming, that they focus a little bit. Don't just look at a little bit of this and a little bit of that for everything that's good to help them personally. It's good to do that, but it's good to find out what's good for you personally. Mm-hmm. But it's also good not to have too much of a buffet style. Like if you go into a restaurant with, when I used to bring Lama tours and we'd drive down through the deep south with these van load with 12 singing, dancing Tibetan Lamas. And you pass these buffets, southern buffets, where they'll advertise like 500 different dishes. So I always tell them when we go in, take a look, choose 5 or 6, stick to them, and then we leave. I want to spend 4 hours with people walking around. So I think it is important to see what's useful and to stick to it a little bit more rather than to continue just buffeting and sampling.
Yeah.
And with what works, go with what works. When Dalai Lama gives a teaching, at the end of it, he often says, during the last week or however long the teaching was, I said many things, and regard these as menus, items on a menu in a restaurant.
Oh.
And things that work for you, you should take. And if you doesn't seem meaningful or relevant or interesting to you, just don't bother about it. And perhaps someone else in the audience will find that very, very interesting and useful, but just choose for you what is interesting and useful for you. And Dalai Lama often says that at the end of every long teaching he gives, major teaching, because, you know, it's often will be on a Tibetan classic or an Indian classic like Bodhicharya Avatar or one of Nagarjuna's great books, or Atisha's or Asanga's. And these things will have many different levels for all kinds of people, right? And I think that's important in our practice. See what you like and stick with it. And, you know, as long as you still feel benefit. And what I always remind my own students of some of Buddha's last words were to be like an analyst buying gold. Don't take anything on faith. And the way he put it was, don't accept it just because I said it. In other words, just because this is a statement from Buddha or a Dalai Lama or your own root guru, don't accept it just because it's said. It should meet your reason. Everyone's reason is different, right? What's very logical for one person may not be logical for another. So it has to meet your reason. And secondly, when you take it on as a practice, you can feel some benefit. Like, for instance, when I was in Ecuador teaching, a New Guinea headhunter came to one of my sessions, not to listen to my talk, but to meet with me afterwards. And he was saying, you know, we're having a real problem in the Amazon because in the old days, you know, a few times a month, we'd go out hunting enemy tribes members and then, you know, cut off their heads and bring their heads home and shrink them and hang them up on our wall in our hut. You know, they sew the eyes and the mouth closed and the neck closed so that they can keep the spirit inside to get the spirit to them. But then the government has outlawed this. And so for us, this is a real problem. Now we're suffering from a real overpopulation problem in the Amazon. What should I do? And I said, well, remember Buddha's reason. There should be Buddha's 2 conditions. Should meet your reason. Doesn't matter what the government says, it should meet your reason. Secondly, should be what you think is useful. From spiritual side of that, I said, now you can bring in Shantideva said, so long as it doesn't contradict Dharma, go along with social convention.
Yeah.
So I said, I don't know what that means to you as a headhunter. How anything the law contradicts your Dharma, that's your choice, not my choice. So I always tell my students, you know, that whatever you think, it should meet your reason and seem very sensible and meaningful to you. And then when you bring it into your life as a life principle, say meditating twice a day or practicing love and compassion, trying to practice patience and forgiveness and these kind of things, or meditating on emptiness or doing mantras or Tummo, there should be some sort of reasonable understanding from your side where it's not a square peg in a round hole. It should be a match. It should match, not mismatch. And secondly, when you try it, you should feel some benefit. So I'm not sure if that Amazonian Ecuadorian headhunter left thinking or not.
I wonder.
But that wasn't Buddha's purpose, was not to give answers to his students.
True.
The Buddha's purpose was to have them use that as a formula in their own decision making. I think that's sometimes a problem with Tibetan Buddhism, in that they talk about Lama Ka, the instruction of the Lama. And I know Chögyam Trungpa used to translate that as the command of the Lama.
Yeah.
Which, because he liked a militant kind of brand, I suppose, of Buddhism. But we should remember Ka there just means word or advice. And so with my own students, I always say these two are most important, is that think about meaning, and if it means something to you, say, oh yeah, probably true. And then you try it, and if it works, you say, okay, not only is it true, it's useful. I mean, there's many things that are true that aren't useful.
Yeah. Sure.
Knowing the number of ants on a particular anthill might be true. But how useful is it unless you're an anteater, for example? Yeah. Anyway, we should stop here, I think, because
Thank you so much.
Quite long, and if you're cutting it down to edit it down for anything will take you hours. So Gyawa di Yorduda Shenze Wantrubune, Draw Chikum Malapati, Sala Cooper, Changes, I'm sure Rinpoche, my Kipana Kiguchi, Kipanyamba, Mepayong, Kone Kondo Gawar Show. Cheers, guys. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for spending this time with us.
Yeah, it was very precious, and we wish you a beautiful day.
Yes.
Thank you. Oh, yes, and I forgot to say, Happy St. Patrick's Day.
You remember. Very good.
Well, here you see, in America, often we celebrate it on the nearest Sunday.
Right.
So here, most Irish folks were celebrating yesterday, because Monday is kind of a work day. So often they celebrate, they have the big parade in Chicago on the nearest Sunday, and they pour yellow food coloring into the river, turn the whole red. McDonald's throughout the whole country for a week before and up until a few days after sell yellow, green milkshakes, they call them shamrock milkshakes.
Yeah. So slancha.
Bye-bye for now, guys.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.